Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick's smirk was broadcast across the nation when he told a struggling small business owner, "Perhaps you're not fit for the new economy." But that smirk vanished when Representative Jasmine Crockett produced a copy of his own former company's predatory contract, Live on C. Within minutes, the clip metastasized across the internet. On Twitter, hashtag LUTNICK, smirk, hashtag grit, to adapt, and hashtag the rolling pin became the top 3 trending topics in the United States. Managed chaos as producers saw their viewership metrics spike to levels usually reserved for presidential debates. Phones began to vibrate on silent in the pockets of press secretaries and chiefs of staff all over Washington, D.C., each call a new front in a political brushfire that had just been ignited on the quietest channel in cable television. The battle wasn't just about a congresswoman and a cabinet secretary anymore. It was about a single, cutting remark that managed to crystallize the anxieties of millions of Americans into one endlessly replayable moment of raw contempt. 48 hours earlier, the world, according to Howard Lutnick, was orderly, profitable, and efficient. From his sprawling office on the top floor of the Herbert C. Hoover Building, the Secretary of Commerce could gaze down upon a city he was actively reshaping. The view was panoramic, a landscape of federal power. But Lutnick was more interested in the unseen architecture of the American economy, a structure he was renovating with the brutal speed of a Wall Street trader. His morning had been a success. A delegation from Global Harvest Foods, a titan of food distribution and logistics, had just left, their faces beaming. They were the primary beneficiaries of his signature policy, the Prosperity Modernization Act. And their gratitude was as immense as their market cap. They're projecting a 7% reduction in Lutnick's chief of staff, a man whose ambition was matched only by his deference. 7%. That's billions in consumer savings. Lutnick leaned back in his leather chair, a throne of his own design. He didn't smile. Satisfaction for him was a quiet internal hum, not a public display. It's not about savings, Marcus. It's about strength. We're trimming the fat, consolidating the supply chain, making it resilient. You can't have 1,000 different tiny bakeries, each with their own flour guy and their own trucker. It's weak. It's inefficient. One big supplier, one network, one standard. That's strength. The tiny bakeries were not a hypothetical. They were the acknowledged casualties of his policy, the fat he was so intent on trimming. The Prosperity Modernization Act had rewritten federal distribution guidelines, ostensibly to streamline commerce and ensure food safety. In practice, it created a regulatory labyrinth so complex and expensive that only behemoths like Global Harvest Foods could navigate it. Small, local suppliers who had for generations sold flour to a town's bakery or fresh produce to its diner were now locked out, unable to afford the new tracking technology and certification fees. This forced the small businesses into the waiting arms of Global Harvest, who offered them a lifeline in the form of an exclusive, ironclad contract. The pushback is minimal, Marcus continued, scrolling through a report on his tablet. Some grumbling from the usual suspects in the House. The Small Business Committee is making noise. But they don't have subpoena power over us on this. It's a commerce issue. Let them make noise, Lutnick said, his eyes fixed on the Washington Monument, a stark, unbending needle against the sky. They're arguing with the future. It's like being angry at a calculator for being better at math than an abacus. The market is a tool. It rewards efficiency and punishes nostalgia. Anyone who can't see that will be left behind. It's not personal, it's just progress. He picked up a briefing memo for his C-SPAN appearance. On Wednesday, Washington Journal call-in show. It's a softball, exactly, Marcus agreed. A victory lap. You get to explain the benefits of the act directly to the people. No media filter. Just you, the host, and a few grateful citizens. Lutnick tossed the memo onto his desk. He didn't need to prepare. He had been selling versions of this philosophy his entire life, from the trading floor at Cantor Fitzgerald to the boardrooms of a dozen tech startups. The product was always the same, a future that was bigger, faster, and more profitable, with the terms and conditions written in fine print by the people who owned the platform, the small business owners, the family-run shops, the legacy operators. They weren't his audience. They were his raw material, more than 350 miles away. In a cramped and cluttered office in the Rayburn House office building, Representative Jasmine Crockett was staring at the fine print. It wasn't a policy brief or a legislative summary. It was an email sent at 2:17 a.m. from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Help for the Rolling Pin Bakery, a constituent in crisis via NC." It had been automatically forwarded from her general counsel's inbox, which was itself a forward from the office of a North Carolina congressman whose staffer knew Crockett's team had a reputation for taking on weird, unwinnable fights. The sender was a woman named Sarah Jenkins. The email was long, detailed, and radiated a calm, desperate clarity. Crockett read it once, then twice. She opened the attachments. The first was a PDF, a 48-page distribution and partnership agreement. From Global Harvest Foods, Crockett, a lawyer by training, felt a familiar chill as she scrolled through it. It was a masterpiece of corporate warfare, disguised as a contract. Mandatory arbitration clauses, non-compete agreements that would prevent the Jenkins family from operating any food-based business within a 100-mile radius if they terminated, and a clause that gave Global Harvest the unilateral and absolute right to adjust pricing and delivery schedules based on market dynamics without notice. The second attachment was a series of scanned letters. The friendly, welcoming tone of the first letter from Global Harvest gave way to increasingly terse, demanding correspondence from their legal department, threatening litigation over breach of exclusivity because Sarah had tried to buy a small batch of specialty flour from a local farmer she'd worked with for 20 years. The final attachment was an Excel spreadsheet. It was a ledger of a dying business. Columns for flour, sugar, yeast, and butter showed price increases of 200 to 300% over the last 6 months, since the day Sarah had signed the Global Harvest contract. A new column labeled Expedited Delivery Surcharge appeared a month ago, adding thousands to her monthly costs. Her bakery, the Rolling Pin, a business started by her grandfather, a pillar of Asheville, North Carolina, for 60 years, was 2 months from insolvency. Her legislative director, Leo Ramirez, a young man who ran on caffeine and righteous indignation, appeared at her door. "Read this," she said, forwarding the email to his computer. "The whole thing, the attachments first." She watched as he stood by her desk, his eyes scanning the screen. She saw his expression shift from curiosity to concern, then to anger. This is extortion," he finally said, looking up. "The pricing adjustment clause alone is unconscionable." "Too," Crockett said, tapping the screen. "Mandatory arbitration. They'll never see a courtroom. It'll be handled by a neutral third party that Global Harvest has on retainer. Sarah Jenkins doesn't have a case. She has a death sentence." "The Prosperity Modernization Act," Leo breathed, connecting the dots. "This is what they were warning us about. We knew it would squeeze suppliers, but this is the endgame, forcing the businesses themselves into a trap." Crockett leaned back, her mind racing. This wasn't just a bad contract. It was a policy outcome. It was the direct, predictable result of legislation designed to benefit the powerful. Sarah Jenkins wasn't just a victim of a corporate predator. She was a victim of her own government. "Who do we know at the Small Business Committee?" Leo asked, already pulling up his contacts. "We can get her to testify. We can write a letter to the FTC." To slow Crockett cut him off. "By the time we get a hearing scheduled, the bakery will be a parking lot. They need leverage now, not in 6 months." Her own schedule taped to the side of her monitor. Her eyes landed on a slot for Wednesday morning. C-SPAN Washington Journal, 9:15 a.m. Leo frowned. It's a 5-minute hit on the new jobs report. Fluff you'll be on right after the Secretary of Commerce. Crockett froze. "Lutnick, Howard Lutnick is on before me." "Yeah," Leo said. "He's on for the whole first half hour, taking calls." A slow smile spread across Crockett's face. It wasn't a smile of humor, but of dawning, dangerous opportunity. "Leo, cancel my prep for the jobs report. I want you and the legal team to do a deep dive. I want to know everything about Global Harvest Foods. I want to know their board of directors, their lobbying expenses, and their PAC donations. And then I want you to go back. I want to know if there are any historical ties, any patterns, any connections at all between their business model and Cantor Fitzgerald in the late 90s and early aughts." Leo looked confused. "Cantor? Lutnick's? Old firm? What's the connection? I don't know if there is one, Crockett admitted, but I've seen contracts like this before. When I was a public defender, I saw them from payday lenders. When I did civil rights law, I saw them from predatory landlords. They're all built the same way. They use complexity as a weapon. They create a system where the little guy can't possibly win. Lutnick didn't invent this model, but he perfected it in the financial world. I want to know if his philosophy has fingerprints on this. She stood up and began to pace the small office, the energy in the room shifting from despair to defiance, and gets Sarah Jenkins on the phone. I need to know if she's willing to make a call tomorrow morning. The why was no longer a question. It was a burning imperative. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just stepping onto a battlefield for a constituent she'd never met. She was a defense attorney who had just been handed her star witness and the prosecution's own playbook. The C-SPAN studio was no longer a place for a fluff piece. It was a venue. It was a courtroom. And court was about to be in session. The next 36 hours were a blur of focused activity. While Howard Lutnick enjoyed a dinner with telecom executives, Crockett and her small team were huddled in her office, fueled by lukewarm coffee and takeout Thai food. They papered the walls with documents, drawing lines and connecting names. Like detectives in a conspiracy film, they found what they were looking for, not in a public filing, but in the archives of a financial trade journal from 1999. It was an article praising a young, aggressive CEO named Howard Lutnick for his innovative use of structured partnership agreements to absorb smaller trading firms. The article detailed a strategy of offering complex, multi-year contracts that promised stability, but contained clauses allowing for the larger firm to incrementally squeeze the smaller partner's margins to zero. It wasn't illegal. It was just, as the journal put it, brilliantly predatory. Leo Ramirez found the smoking gun. He cross-referenced the board of directors for Global Harvest Foods with former executives from Lutnick's era at Cantor Fitzgerald. He found two board members who had been senior vice presidents under Lutnick were now setting the corporate strategy for the very company that was driving Sarah Jenkins out of business. Crockett held the printed-out article in her hand. The pieces were all there. The philosophy, the people, the predatory model. It had just migrated from Wall Street to Main Street, and the Secretary of Commerce was the man who had drawn the map. Late that night, she finally spoke to Sarah Jenkins on the phone. She didn't make any promises. She didn't guarantee a win. She just laid out the facts. Sarah, what they're doing to you is wrong, Crockett said, her voice low and steady, but it's not technically illegal. They've designed it that way. A lawsuit will bankrupt you faster than this contract will, so what do I do? Sarah's voice was thin, weary. Just give them the keys. No, Crockett said. You fight back, but not in a courtroom, in the court of public opinion. Tomorrow morning, the man who created the policy that's killing your business will be on live television taking calls from the American people. I need you to be one. Of those people, I need you to tell your story. Just the facts. Just what happened to your bakery. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Crockett could hear the faint sound of a kitchen, the clinking of utensils. Will it make a difference? Sarah asked. I don't know, Crockett answered honestly, but I will be. There, and I promise you, he will hear you. The whole country will hear you. And I will make sure they understand exactly what they're hearing. By the time Jasmine Crockett arrived at the C-SPAN studio on Wednesday morning, she wasn't just a congresswoman on her way to a media hit. She was an attorney walking into a deposition, armed with her exhibits, her star witness on standby, and a clear line of questioning aimed at dismantling the credibility of the man who was already sitting under the bright studio lights, confidently adjusting his tie. She was calm, focused, and ready. The battlefield was set. The trap was about to be sprung. The C-SPAN studio had the quiet, sterile hum of professional broadcasting. Howard Lutnick sat opposite the host, Greta Van Susteren, projecting an aura of relaxed authority. He was a natural on camera, translating complex economic theories into smooth, digestible sound bites. For 20 minutes, he laid out the case for the Prosperity Modernization Act. He spoke of syllogies, market optimization, and the inevitable march of technological progress. He painted a picture of a streamlined American future, where food was cheaper, safer, and more abundant, all thanks to the efficiencies of scale. He was persuasive, polished, and utterly convinced of his own benevolent foresight. "We're creating a system that is robust enough to weather any storm," Lutnick concluded, leaning forward with paternal earnestness. "It's about ensuring that every family in America has access to a reliable and affordable food supply chain. That's my department's #1 priority." Greta, a veteran host known for her even-keeled approach, nodded. "Mr. Secretary, we have a lot of callers who want to speak with you. We'll start with Sarah in Asheville, North Carolina." "Go ahead, Sarah." A new voice entered the soundscape, transmitted via telephone line. It was clear, but there was a tremor of nervousness in it, the sound of a person stepping into an arena they never sought. "Good morning. Thank you for taking my call." "Good morning, Sarah," Lutnick said, his tone magnanimous. "Mr. Secretary, my family has owned the Rolling Pin Bakery in Asheville for 60 years. We make everything from scratch. We've always used local suppliers of farm for our flour, a local dairy for our milk and butter. Since your Prosperity Modernization Act went into effect, all of our suppliers have told us they can no longer afford to do business with us because of the new certification costs. They've been priced out." Lutnick's expression remained neutral, but he shifted slightly in his chair. This wasn't the grateful citizen he had been expecting. Sarah's voice grew steadier, fueled by the recitation of her own reality. "This forced us to sign an exclusive contract with one of the big national distributors, Global Harvest Foods. Since we signed, our cost for a bag of flour has tripled. Our butter has quadrupled. They've added on thousands of dollars in new fees for things like logistical administration and fuel surcharges, even though the gas prices haven't changed. We are 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, from having to close our doors forever. My question is, how is making it impossible for a 60-year-old family business to survive modernizing anything?" The directness of the question hung in the air. "Greta?" Van Sesteren looked at Lutnick, her pen poised. The control room was silent. Lutnick's first mistake was his posture. He sighed, a small, almost imperceptible exhalation of breath that conveyed not empathy, but impatience. It was the sigh of a busy man being bothered by a triviality. "Well, Sarah," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "First of all, thank you for your call and for your family's contribution to the community over the years." The word contribution was delivered as if it were a eulogy. "But you have to understand, the economy is a dynamic entity. It's not static. It evolves." He was lecturing now, his hands gesturing as if he were explaining a complex equation to a struggling student. What the Prosperity Modernization Act does is it recognizes the realities of the 21st century marketplace. It requires a level of scale, of technological integration, of efficiency that, frankly, older business models can't always support. We can't hold back progress to protect business models that are no longer viable. Sarah's voice cut back in, sharper this time. "My business model was perfectly viable 6 months ago. It was viable for 60 years. It's not the model that's the problem, it's this new system. This contract is a trap." This was Lutnick's moment to retreat, to offer a platitude, to promise to have his staff look into it. He did the opposite. He pressed his advantage, convinced he was winning the argument on intellectual grounds. A slow smirk, a flicker of smug certainty, crossed his lips. It was the expression of a man who believed he was about to deliver a fatal, unanswerable point. "Perhaps," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of mock sincerity. He paused for effect, ensuring the camera was tight on his face. "And I say this respectfully, perhaps you're not fit for the new economy. Perhaps you lack the grit to adapt." Silence. It was a fatal miscalculation. He had intended to frame it as a question of personal fortitude, a classic conservative talking point. But on live television directed at a woman who had just detailed the slow-motion destruction of her family's legacy, it sounded like what it was, the cold, dismissive cruelty of a predator. The smirk lingered a fraction of a second too long. In the control room, the lead producer whispered a single, sharp expletive. Greta Van Sasteren's eyes widened slightly. She was a professional, but she knew a political car crash when she saw one. "Sarah," Greta said, her voice carefully neutral, trying to regain control of her show. "Thank you for your call." The line disconnected. She turned to Lutnick, who still looked pleased with himself. "Mr. Secretary, we have to take a short break. We'll be back with Representative Jasmine Crockett after this." In the small, windowless green room down the hall, Jasmine Crockett watched the monitor. She had the file of documents in her lap. When Lutnick delivered the line about grit, her jaw tightened, but her expression remained calm. She had anticipated his arrogance, but the open contempt was even better than she had hoped for. He hadn't just taken the bait, he had swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. Leo, standing beside her, just shook his head slowly, a grim smile on his face. "He has no idea what's coming," Leo whispered. "He's about to find out," Crockett said, standing up as a producer opened the door. She walked onto the set. During the commercial break, she shook Greta's hand and sat down in the chair, still warm from Howard Lutnick. The secretary was gone, whisked away by his handlers, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to break. As the floor director counted down from 10, Crockett arranged 3 documents neatly on the small table in front of her. She looked into the camera, her gaze direct and unwavering. The light turned red. They were live. "Welcome back to Washington Journal," Greta began, turning to her new guest. "Joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas. Congresswoman, thank you for being here." Before the break, we heard the Secretary of Commerce lay out his case for the administration's economic policies. The latest jobs report shows steady growth. What's your reaction? It was the standard, expected opening, a political sparring match over statistics. Crockett had no intention of playing that game. She looked at Greta, but her words were for the audience. For Sarah Jenkins, and for Howard Lutnick, wherever he was now watching. "Greta, before we get to the jobs report, I want to talk about Sarah from Asheville. I want to talk about grit." The pivot was immediate and sharp. In the control room, the producer sat bolt upright. "This was not on the pre-interview briefing. This was real," Crockett continued, her voice devoid of the outrage that a lesser politician might have feigned. Instead, it was cold, precise, and forensic, the voice of a lawyer laying out the indisputable facts of a case. "We just heard the Secretary of Commerce suggest that a 60-year-old family business is failing because its owner lacks grit. He would have us believe that the Rolling Pin Bakery is a victim of progress, an unfortunate but necessary casualty of a more efficient market." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But that's a misdirection. The truth is, Sarah Jenkins and thousands of other small business owners across this country aren't failing because they lack grit. They are being systematically dismantled by a system that has been rigged against them. And the Secretary of Commerce isn't just a bystander to this. He is one of its chief architects." She picked up the first document from the table. It was a copy of Sarah Jenkins's contract with Global Harvest Foods. This is the contract Sarah was forced to sign. "I'm a lawyer, Greta. I've read it. And I can tell you, it is designed for one purpose only, to transfer every last penny of wealth from that small business to the corporate entity. Let me read you one clause. Section 4, subsection C. The distributor retains the unilateral and absolute right to adjust pricing, fees, and surcharges at any time without prior notice." To reflect market dynamics, she looked back at the camera. "What does that mean in plain English? It means the company can charge you whatever they want, whenever they want, for any reason they want, and you have no recourse. It's not a partnership agreement. It's a certificate of surrender." Greta, sensing the gravity of the moment, interjected carefully, "But that's a contract with a private company, Global Harvest Foods. How is the Secretary of Commerce directly responsible for that?" Crockett had been waiting for that question. It was the linchpin of her entire argument. She put down the first document and picked up the second. It was a printout of the 1999 Trade Journal article. "He's responsible because this model of economic predation isn't new. It has a history, and he knows it intimately." She held up the article for the camera to see. The headline was visible. Cantor's new playbook, How Lutnick's Structured Agreements Are Reshaping the Market. Long before he was a public servant, Secretary Lutnick was a titan on Wall Street, and his reputation was built on creating and executing brilliantly predatory contracts, just like the one that is currently bankrupting Sarah Jenkins's bakery. His firm Cantor Fitzgerald perfected the art of using complex one-sided agreements to absorb or eliminate smaller competitors. The strategy was to offer a deal that seemed too good to refuse, lock them in, and then use the fine print to bleed them dry. She let that accusation settle, a charge of immense gravity. She wasn't just criticizing a policy, she was impeaching the character and career of a sitting cabinet secretary. Then, she picked up the third and final document. It was a single sheet of paper with 2 names on it. The names of the board members at Global Harvest Foods who had previously worked as vice presidents at Cantor Fitzgerald. This isn't a coincidence, Greta. This is a philosophy. It's a business model that has been transplanted from the trading floors of Wall Street to the main streets of towns like Asheville. And it has been nurtured and accelerated by the policies of the Commerce Department itself. The Prosperity Modernization Act created the perfect environment for this predatory model to flourish by eliminating the competition for companies like Global Harvest. She now had all 3 documents laid out in front of her, like exhibits in a trial. She had established the crime, the method, and the motive. It was time for the closing argument. She looked directly into the lens of the main camera, speaking, not to Greta, but through the television to the entire country, and directly to Howard Lutnick. So when the secretary sits in this very chair and smirks while telling a woman fighting for her family's survival that she lacks grit, he's not just being insulting, he's being disingenuous. He knows better than anyone that grit has nothing to do with it when the game is this rigged. She pushed the documents forward on the table. This woman's unfitness isn't a lack of grit. It's this contract, she said, tapping the Global Harvest Agreement. A contract modeled on one your own firm, Mr. Lutnick, famously used to crush smaller competitors. She tapped the other 2 exhibits. A contract being enforced by your former lieutenants. Is this the new economy you're so proud of, one? Where the government helps billionaires write the rules to eliminate the little guy. The silence that followed was deafening. Jasmine Crockett did not smile. She did not look triumphant. She simply looked at the camera, her expression one of solemn, unyielding conviction. She had not raised her voice. She had not performed for the cameras. She had prosecuted her case. In the C-SPAN control room, no one spoke. The producer stared at the bank of monitors, watching his quiet morning show become the epicenter of a political earthquake. He knew with absolute certainty that this clip would define the day, the week, and perhaps the entire tenure of the Secretary of Commerce. Greta Van Susteren, for the first time in her long career, was momentarily speechless. She cleared her throat. "Congresswoman," she said, her voice a little unsteady, "we are out of time." Jasmine Crockett walked off the C-SPAN set with the same deliberate composure she had maintained under the studio lights. She handed her microphone pack to a stunned producer, nodded a quiet thank you, and walked into the hallway. The moment the studio door closed behind her, the carefully constructed wall of prosecutorial calm crumbled, not into emotion, but into the sharp, adrenalized focus of a combatant who knows the battle has just begun. Her legislative director, Leo Ramirez, was waiting for her, his eyes wide. His phone held out like a religious artifact. "It's everywhere," he said, his voice a half-whisper of awe and terror. "I don't mean it's getting traction. I mean it has already saturated the entire ecosystem. It's like we dropped a dye pack into the water and the entire ocean turned red instantly." He didn't need to show her. Crockett pulled her own phone from her jacket pocket. It felt hot to the touch. The screen was a blizzard of notifications, hundreds of them, from news apps, social media, and her private messaging platforms. She saw headlines flash by in the cascade. CNN, Crockett accuses Commerce Secretary Lutnick of predatory business practices in stunning on-air confrontation. FOX News. Dem Rep. Ambushes Lutnick, slams administration's economic agenda. Associated Press, #LUTNICK, smirk trends as C-SPAN clip of tense exchange goes viral. Her colleagues were already weighing in. Texts pinged in rapid succession. A thumbs-up emoji from the House Minority Leader. A message from a senior member of the Congressional Black Caucus, sublime. "You took him apart with a surgeon's scalpel. Call me." A text from a moderate Republican she barely knew from the Agriculture Committee read simply, "He had that coming." His own phone was silent, deliberately kept from him by his chief of staff, Marcus Thorne, who was frantically trying to get ahead of the catastrophe. Marcus was on the phone with the White House communications director, his voice tight with controlled panic. "No, he hasn't seen the full clip yet," Marcus said, his back to Lutnick. "We're telling him it was a predictable partisan attack, a cheap shot." The voice on the other end of the line was cold. "A cheap shot." Marcus, she brought receipts. She brought his entire corporate history. She's not accusing him of being a bad secretary. She's accusing him of being a lifelong corporate gangster and using his office to continue the racket. The president is going to want to know why you let his Commerce Secretary walk into a wood chipper. We didn't know she had this, Marcus stammered. Her scheduled topic was the jobs report. She's a trial lawyer, Marcus. She doesn't play by the topic schedule. You prepped him for a policy debate, and she showed up for a murder trial. Get him ready. He has to make a statement. We need to discredit her, fast. Lutnick, annoyed at being ignored, snatched the phone from Marcus's hand. What the hell is going on? He barked into the receiver. It was a call from some broke baker. I handled it. Howard, this is Cerebeth. The White House comes, director said, her voice now dangerously calm. Have you watched the segment that came after yours? No, Lutnick snapped. Why? You need to turn on the TV the second you get back to your office. And then you and I are going to have a very serious conversation about the meaning of the phrase brilliantly predatory. The line went dead. Lutnick threw the phone back at Marcus. What is she talking about? What did Crockett say? Marcus swallowed hard. There were documents, sir. She connected Global Harvest to Cantor. Lutnick's face, which had been flushed with anger, went pale. The fury was instantly replaced by a cold, reptilian focus. He understood. This wasn't a political hit. This was a character assassination, executed with lethal precision, using the ammunition of his own past. He said nothing for the rest of the ride, his jaw a knot of granite. The battle wasn't about a policy anymore. It was about his name. By the time Jasmine Crockett arrived back at her apartment that night, the adrenaline had long since evaporated, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. The viral storm had only intensified. The clip of her dismantling Lutnick's argument had been played on a loop on every cable news channel. Pundits were dissecting every word, every gesture. Her office had fielded over 200 media requests. She had done what she set out to do. She had changed the conversation. And now, alone in the quiet of her apartment, she felt the cost of it. Her body ached from holding a position of rigid stillness for so long. The wave of initial support from allies was now being met by a ferocious, organized backlash. Her official email inbox was a toxic waste dump. Her chief of staff had sent her a summary, advising her not to look at the raw feed. The usual racist, sexist stuff, but amplified by about 1,000, the text read. We're filtering everything. But some of it always got through. Her personal voicemail was full. She listened to one message before she could stop herself. The voice was male, distorted by rage. It wasn't a political critique. It was a spew of racial slurs, misogynistic filth, and a graphic, detailed threat of violence. We know where you live, you loudmouthed. She clicked delete, her hand trembling slightly. She had been a public defender. She had faced down angry men in courtrooms. She had received threats before, but this felt different. It was more personal, more voluminous. It was the faceless, limitless rage of the internet, channeled directly at her, summoned by a 10-minute television appearance. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the apartment's air conditioning. Her phone rang. The screen read, Mom. She took a deep breath and answered, forcing a lightness into her voice she did not feel. Hi, Mama. Jasmine Felicia Crockett. Her mother's voice came through, a familiar blend of pride and worry. I saw you on the news. Your father would have been so proud. You didn't let them breathe. Crockett sank onto her couch, the praise a warm balm on a raw wound. Thanks, Mama. I appreciate that. But Jas, her mother's tone shifted, the pride edged out by fear. I heard what they're saying. About you on that other channel. The things they're calling you, the lies they're telling. These people, they're dangerous. Howard Lutnick is a powerful man, a billionaire, with the president on his side. Is it worth it? Is it worth putting yourself in their crosshairs like this? It was the question she had been asking herself in the quiet moments all day. Was it worth the poison now flooding her inbox? Was it worth the fear that made her double-check the lock on her door? She thought of Sarah Jenkins's voice on the phone, the sound of a person caught in a slow-moving financial vice. She thought of the cold, dismissive smirk on Lutnick's face, the face of a man who had never known a day of true economic fear in his life. passing judgment on a woman who was living it every single day. I didn't have a choice, Crockett said, her voice quiet but firm. They wrote the rules so that woman couldn't win. They cornered her. They were crushing her and her family, and they were proud of it. What was I supposed to do? Let them get away with it because I was scared. There was a pause on the line. She heard her mother sigh, a sound of resignation and understanding. "No," her mother said softly. "No, I suppose not. That's not how I raised you. Just be careful, baby. Please, be careful. I will, Mama, I promise." They hung up, and Crockett sat in the silence, the weight of her mother's fear settling on her shoulders. It was one thing to absorb the threats herself. It was another to know that her fight was causing anxiety for the people she loved. That was the hidden cost, the price of admission that no one saw on television. The victory felt hollowed out by the exhaustion and the quiet. The aftershock of the C-SPAN segment hit the rolling pin bakery like a physical force. Sarah Jenkins had spent the morning in a daze. After her call with the Secretary of Commerce, she had sat at her kitchen table. Her husband, Mark, had held her, telling her she had done all she could. They had watched Crockett's segment together on his phone, huddled over the small screen. When Crockett held up her contract, Sarah had gasped. When she held up the article about Cantor Fitzgerald, Mark had sworn under his breath, and when Crockett delivered the final lines, looking directly into the camera as if speaking only to them, Sarah began to weep again. But this time, the tears were not from frustration. They were tears of profound, soul-shaking validation. Someone understood. Someone not only saw their struggle, but understood the mechanics of it, the deliberate, cruel design. Someone was fighting for them. Then the phone started ringing. And it didn't stop. The first call was from the local Asheville newspaper. The second was from a producer at Good Morning America. The third was from a man in Oregon who wanted to buy $1,000 worth of scones and have them donated to a local shelter. The fourth was a high school classmate she hadn't spoken to in 20 years. A man called and screamed at her to get some grit before hanging up. Another accused her of being a paid Democratic operative. By noon, a local news van was parked across the street from the bakery. Its long-lensed camera, a malevolent, unblinking eye, customers came in not just to buy bread, but to stare, to offer support, to ask questions. Her small bakery, her sanctuary, had become a tourist attraction, a set piece in a national drama. She felt a surge of agoraphobia, a desire to lock the doors and hide in the back, overwhelmed by the sudden glaring spotlight. She was grateful, but she was also terrified. She had wanted help, but she had never wanted this. That evening, as she and Mark were cleaning up the kitchen, preparing for another day, her cell phone rang with an unknown Washington, D.C. number. Wary, she almost ignored it, but something made her answer. "Hello, is this Sarah Jenkins?" The voice on the other end asked. It was professional, but warm. "It is. Who is this? This is Jasmine Crockett. I'm so sorry to call you unannounced, but I wanted to check in and see how you were doing." Sarah froze, flour still on her hands. She looked at Mark, her eyes wide, and mouthed the name, Jasmine Crockett. I don't know what to say. Thank you what you did today. No one has ever stood up for us like that." "You're the one who stood up?" Sarah Crockett's voice replied. A note of the same wariness Sarah felt in her own bones. "You had the courage to call in and tell your story in front of the entire country. None of this would have happened without you. I just provided the legal analysis." They spoke for 15 minutes. Crockett didn't talk about politics or strategy. She asked about Sarah's family, about the history of the bakery. She listened as Sarah described the stress of the past few days, the fear, and the unexpected flood of support. Crockett gave her the contact information for a nonprofit legal group that specialized in fighting predatory contracts. Offering to make the introduction herself, "I know it's overwhelming right now," Crockett said before they hung up. "The media, the attention, it will fade. But the contract is still real. The fight isn't over. But I want you to know that you are not alone in it anymore." When the call ended, Sarah Jenkins stood in her quiet bakery kitchen, the familiar smell of yeast and sugar in the air. The television news cycle was a distant, abstract thing. But the feeling of having a powerful, compassionate voice on her side was the most concrete reality in the world. The fear was still there, but for the first time in months, it was joined by something else. something she hadn't felt since she first read the Global Harvest contract, a flicker of hope. The fight had taken a toll on both women, separated by hundreds of miles but now inextricably linked. One had lost her privacy, the other her peace of mind. But in that shared cost, a powerful and unlikely alliance had been forged. The days following the C-SPAN broadcast felt like a prolonged political concussion for the White House and the Department of Commerce. The story refused to recede. Instead of burning out in a 24-hour cycle, it had lodged itself in the public consciousness. Howard Lutnick's smirk and Jasmine Crockett's .com recitation of facts became a durable meme, a shorthand for the yawning chasm between the powerful and the struggling. Every attempt by the administration to change the subject was met with a fresh wave of stories about Sarah Jenkins and the Rolling Pin Bakery. Reporters had descended on Asheville, turning the small business into a national symbol. The hashtag #GritToAdapt was now used with biting sarcasm against any politician or CEO who uttered a dismissive platitude. Under immense pressure from the White House to fix this, Lutnick agreed to a primetime interview on a friendly cable news network. It was a strategic blunder born of arrogance, surrounded by deferential lighting and a host who lobbed softball questions. Lutnick's attempt to project authority came across as imperious. He sat stiffly, his jaw tight, the ghost of the smirk still visible to a nation now trained to look for it. "My remarks were inartful, and I regret if anyone took offense," he began, reading from a mental script that had been focus grouped into utter meaninglessness. But let's not be distracted from the larger truth. The American economy is the most competitive in the world, and that competition, while sometimes difficult, is what drives innovation and prosperity for everyone. The host nodded sympathetically. "Congresswoman Crockett seems to believe you are personally targeting small businesses. How do you respond to that? That's a radical socialist talking point. And frankly, it's absurd," Lutnick retorted, a flash of his true anger breaking through the polished veneer. "This congresswoman is a public defender. She doesn't understand how wealth is created. She doesn't understand that for an economy to grow, some businesses must unfortunately make way for more efficient, more innovative ones. It's the law of the market, not a personal vendetta. This is creative destruction, the very engine of capitalism." The interview was a disaster. The non-apology apology, the condescending lecture on economics, the dismissal of Crockett's professional background, it all reinforced the exact image she had so skillfully painted, a detached plutocrat who saw every day Americans as unfortunate but necessary collateral damage in his grand economic experiment. Before the segment was even over, social media was ablaze with criticism. He had not doused the fire. He had thrown a gallon of gasoline on it. Far from the noise of cable news, in a quiet, book-lined study in Georgetown, George F. Caldwell watched the interview with a grimace. Caldwell was a relic from a different era of conservatism, a columnist for a legacy newspaper whose intellectual lineage traced back to William F. Buckley, Jr. Not to the populist rage of talk radio, he was a staunch believer in free markets, individual liberty, and fiscal discipline. He had been an early and vocal never-Trump Republican, viewing the administration's brand of nationalist cronyism as a grotesque perversion of the principles he had defended his entire career. He had watched Crockett's C-SPAN appearance with a professional's appreciation for its brutal effectiveness. He disagreed with her on almost every policy issue, from healthcare to environmental regulation, but he could not deny the power of her argument. She had used facts, not feelings. She had exposed a rot that he, too, found repulsive. Then he watched. Lutnick's fumbling, arrogant rebuttal and his disgust solidified into conviction. He turned to his computer and began to type. 2 days later, Caldwell's column appeared on the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal. It was titled, "Howard Lutnick's Un-American Market." The column was a thunderclap for those who believe. In the power of free and fair markets, Caldwell began. The recent spectacle involving Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick ought to be deeply alarming. It is not, as the Secretary and his defenders claim, a simple spat between a capitalist and a socialist. It is something far more dangerous, a case study in the replacement of genuine capitalism with government-sanctioned cronyism. He methodically dismantled Lutnick's defense. The Secretary speaks of creative destruction, invoking the ghost of Joseph Schumpeter. but Schumpeter was describing a process where new innovations and better ideas organically displace the old. What Representative Crockett so skillfully exposed was not creative destruction. It was just destruction, plain and simple. It was the deliberate strangulation of a small enterprise, not by a superior competitor, but by a predatory leviathan armed with a government-mandated monopoly and a contract designed to enslave. The column's most devastating passage landed like a body blow on the administration's narrative. A free market requires a level playing field, clear rules, and voluntary exchange. The system crushing Sarah Jenkins's bakery has none of these. It is a rigged game where the government, in the name of efficiency, picks a corporate winner and then helps that winner eliminate all its competition. This is not capitalism. This is corporatism. This is a strain of economic fascism that ought to be as repugnant to a true conservative as it is to a progressive on this singular issue. One must concede a terrible irony. Last week, the most articulate and effective defender of the principles of a fair market wasn't the billionaire Secretary of Commerce, but the public defender from Texas. The impact was immediate and profound. Caldwell's column acted as an intellectual permission slip for Republicans and independents, who were privately appalled by Lutnick but were hesitant to side with a progressive Democrat. Phones began ringing in the offices of GOP senators on the Commerce and Small Business Committees. The conversation was no longer about partisan politics. It was about fundamental fairness. Caldwell had reframed the debate, elevating it from an attack on one man to a defense of an American ideal. The White House's narrative, already battered, was now completely shattered. The political ground had shifted seismically. The chairman of the House Small Business Committee, a moderate Republican from the Midwest who had previously been monitoring the situation, now found his voice. He announced that the committee would hold emergency hearings on the impact of the Prosperity Modernization Act on small-scale enterprises, and formally requested in a letter co-signed by 3 other Republicans that Secretary Lutnick appear to testify. The word request was a public nicety. It was a demand, and everyone knew it. Simultaneously, the story began to multiply. Spurred by the national attention, other small business owners who had been trapped in Global Harvest Foods contracts began contacting reporters. A butcher in Wisconsin, a family-owned grocery in Pennsylvania, a small cafe in Florida each had a story nearly identical to Sarah Jenkins's. A class action lawsuit was being organized. Global Harvest Foods, which had initially released a defiant statement, went silent, its stock price sliding by 6% in 2 days. In Jasmine Crockett's office, the mood was electric. Leo Ramirez was practically vibrating with excitement, taping copies of favorable news clippings and Caldwell's column to the wall. "We have him," Leo said, pacing in front of her desk. "He's cornered. The committee hearing is the kill shot. You'll be the lead questioner. You can finish what you started. This is your moment." He laid out a media schedule. Every major network wanted her. The Sunday shows were fighting over who would get her first exclusive since the C-SPAN hit. It was a politician's dream, a chance to seize the national spotlight and drive the narrative for weeks to come. Crockett listened patiently, nodding, watching the frantic energy swirl around her. She looked at Caldwell's column again. He had understood her strategy perfectly, even if he'd come at it from the opposite ideological pole. He saw that her power came from the facts, not from her personality or her politics. And in that, she saw her own path forward. She let Leo finish his triumphant pitch, then held up a hand. "Cancel it," she said quietly. Leo stopped pacing. "Cancel what?" "The Sunday shows." "We can pick one. Cancel all of it," Crockett said. "I'm not doing any interviews, and I'm not going to be the lead questioner at the hearing." Leo stared at her, utterly baffled. "I don't understand." "Jasmine, this is it. We won. Why would you walk away from the microphone now?" "Because it's not about me," she said, her voice firm. "The second this becomes the Jasmine Crockett show, we lose. The focus shifts from the victims to the political fight. It becomes just another partisan circus. Lutnick gets to hide behind that, calling me a radical, and his allies will rally to him. We can't let that happen." She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the Capitol complex. Caldwell's column gave us the opening. He made this a bipartisan issue of fairness. My job now is to keep it that way. I'm not going to be the star prosecutor at that hearing. The stars of that hearing are going to be Sarah Jenkins, and the butcher from Wisconsin, and the grocer from Pennsylvania. They are the ones who will testify. Their voices are the only ones that matter. Leo was starting to understand the strategy, but he still saw a missed opportunity. But you need to be the one to land the final blow. To make the closing argument, "Oh, I will," Crockett said, a flicker of the public defender's steel in her eyes. But not in a committee room, not on his turf. We're going to do it on our own terms. She turned back to face him, her plan fully formed. The day before that hearing, I'm going back home to Dallas. We're going to find a small business in my district, a machine shop, a family restaurant, a hardware store. I don't care which one a place, just like Sarah's, and I'm going to hold a press conference. Right there on their loading dock. I'm not going to talk about Howard Lutnick. I'm not going to talk about Cantor Fitzgerald. I'm going to talk about the American promise. I'm going to define the principle we're fighting for, far away from this swamp. It was a brilliant, strategic pivot. She would cede the Washington spotlight to the victims themselves, letting their authentic stories drive the hearing. Then she would deliver her own definitive statement from the heartland, connecting the abstract policy debate to the tangible lives of her own constituents. She wasn't just winning a news cycle. She was building a case in the minds of the American public, preparing them for a verdict on a principle, not just a person. "Find me that business, Leo," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We're going home." The week leading up to the House Small Business Committee hearing was a masterclass in political stagecraft, just not by the person everyone expected. The Washington, D.C. media machine was in a frenzy, hyping the showdown. Between the embattled Secretary of Commerce and the small business owners he had maligned, Sarah Jenkins, now represented by the pro bono legal group Crockett had connected her with, had become a reluctant but poised public figure. She had arrived. In Washington, not as a victim, but as the lead plaintiff in a case against an entire economic philosophy. Pundits on every channel debated what fireworks would fly when Lutnick was finally forced to face her under the Klieg lights and the penalty of perjury, and Jasmine Crockett was nowhere to be seen. Her absence was a source of intense speculation. "A stunning strategic blunder," declared one cable news host. After landing a knockout punch, Crockett is refusing to come out for the next round. Another analyst, more astute, mused that she was either incredibly clever or incredibly foolish, ceding the biggest political stage of her career to others. Her office deflected all inquiries with a simple, maddeningly opaque statement. The Congresswoman is in her district this week, attending to the needs of her constituents. In Dallas, the air was thick with the smell of cut steel and ozone. There were no Klieg lights at Alameda and Sons Metal Works, only the long, sharp shadows of a Texas afternoon. The business was a sprawling, corrugated steel building that had been in the same spot for 50 years, a testament to the endurance of grit and skill. Inside, sparks flew from grinding wheels, and the hydraulic press stamped out custom parts with a rhythmic, percussive roar. It was here, at a simple wooden lectern set up on the concrete of the loading dock, that Jasmine Crockett chose to make her definitive statement. The press corps was a motley crew. Seasoned local reporters from Dallas-Fort Worth stood shoulder to shoulder, with national correspondents from New York and Washington who had flown in on the hunch that this was the real story. Behind Crockett stood 3 generations of the Almeida family, the patriarch, Hector, a man in his 70s with hands like worn leather, his son Carlos, who now ran the day-to-day operations, and his granddaughter Maria, a recent engineering graduate from Texas A&M. They were not props. They were the entire point. Crockett stepped to the microphone. She wore a simple blue blazer and spoke without notes, her eyes scanning the faces of the reporters and the workers who had paused to watch. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice calm and clear over the distant hum of machinery. "I want to thank the Almeida family for welcoming us to their business today. For 50 years, this company has been more than just a company. It's been a launchpad for careers, a source of strength for this community, and a quiet promise. Kapora Place, that proves that if you master a craft and treat people right, you can build something that lasts." She gestured toward the workshop behind her. Last week in Washington, there was a lot of talk about a bakery in North Carolina, but this story isn't about bakeries. It's not about contracts or a single cabinet secretary. It's about places. Like this, It's about the fundamental promise that we make to each other as Americans." She paused, letting the silence hang in the warm air. That promise is simple. It's the one that allows a man like Hector Almeida to turn his skill into a legacy. It's the one that says, if you work hard, if you play by the rules, you get a fair shot. It's the one that says you should be judged by the quality of your work and the content of your character, not by the size of your competitor's lobbying budget. And it's a promise that says you should never, ever have to compete against your own government. The national correspondents scribbled furiously. This was the soundbite. This was the principle. What we saw exposed last week was the corrosion of that promise, Crockett continued, her voice gaining a lawyerly intensity. We saw a system where the rules were being rewritten by the most powerful, for the most powerful, a system that mistakes complexity for sophistication and predation for progress. A system that would look at a business like this, a business that has survived recessions and booms, and call it inefficient because it puts the quality of its product ahead of the quarterly returns for a distant shareholder. The question for our country is not whether we will have a new economy. The question is what kind of new economy we will have. Will it be one that concentrates wealth and power in the hands of a few, turning everyone else into a contractor or a franchisee with no rights and no future? Or will it be one that fosters innovation on every corner, that values the grit of a master machinist as much as the algorithm of a tech mogul that creates more opportunities for more people? She looked from the reporters to the Almeida family, her expression softening. The purpose of our economy should be to create more Sarah Jenkinses and more Mr. Almeidas, not to make their survival impossible. That is the principle we fought for in Washington last week. It's the principle their voices will defend in a hearing room tomorrow. And it's the one we will continue to defend right here at home, she finished. Thank you. A barrage of questions followed. Congresswoman, do you believe Secretary Lutnick should resign? Shouted a reporter from CNN. I believe the Small Business Committee will do its job tomorrow, Crockett replied smoothly. My focus today is on ensuring businesses like Almeida and Sons have the federal support they need to compete and thrive, yelled another. Crockett's eyes found Maria Almeida, the young engineer. My message is for Maria, she said, her voice carrying a new warmth. My message is that your generation deserves to inherit an economy where your ingenuity and hard work are the only things that determine your success. We're fighting to make sure you do. She took 2 more questions about local enterprise zones and then ended the press conference. She had executed her strategy perfectly. She had defined the moral stakes of the conflict on her own terms, making the coming hearing in Washington not the main event, but merely a confirmation of the principle she had just laid down. She had recentered the entire national debate from a loading dock in Dallas. The next day, the hearing was a political bloodbath. Sarah Jenkins's testimony was quiet, factual, and devastating. The butcher from Wisconsin presented invoices that showed Global Harvest charging him more for meat than he could sell it for. The grocer from Pennsylvania wept, as she described, laying off employees her family had known for decades, without Crockett there to act as a partisan lightning rod. The Republican members of the committee were free to express their own outrage. They grilled Lutnick not as Democrats, but as defenders of the free market ideals Caldwell's column had invoked. Trapped, and with the White House offering no public support, Lutnick capitulated. He announced that the Commerce Department would immediately suspend the implementation of the Prosperity Modernization Act, pending a full top-to-bottom 90-day review. 2 days later, facing a shareholder revolt and a potential class action lawsuit, Global Harvest Foods announced it was hiring an outside firm to proactively restructure all of its small business partnership agreements. It was a stunning, unambiguous victory. 1 month later, the news cycle had moved on. The world was consumed by other crises, other dramas. In a cluttered office behind the service bays of Jensen & Son Automotive in Des Moines, Iowa, Dave Jensen was staring at a piece of paper that made his stomach churn.